World War II, The Call of Duty. Chapter 24. Brave New World, July to September 1945. Written by Liam Dale. Narrated by Liam Dale. As the Western world celebrated peace in Europe and the overthrow of Adolf Hitler's regime, the war continued to rage in the Pacific, and there was still no end in sight for the battles of the Far East. For the Japanese, to surrender was a fate worse than death, and driven by ancient traditions, they were determined to fight to the very last man. As Allied casualties continued to rise and the United States prepared for their invasion of the Japanese home islands, there were soon grave decisions to be made, and in the final stage of the global conflict, steps would be taken to defeat the Eastern enemy, which would transform the face of war forever. This last chapter brings us to the conclusion of a conflict which would prove to be the most destructive in the history of mankind, and the events of July to September 1945 would not only mark the end of the Second World War, but the beginning of a brave and dangerous new world. On July 17, 1945, the leaders of the victorious nations met in Potsdam, just a few miles west of Berlin, to discuss the future of post-war Germany. Among those attending was the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose future in office, as I previously mentioned, was by now far from assured. Not long after VE Day, the British wartime coalition had broken up, and a general election would soon decide whether Churchill was re-elected as Prime Minister or replaced by the Labour leader Clement Attlee. The Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin also attended the Potsdam Conference and was by now reaping the rewards of Germany's defeat as he laid claim to territory in Central Europe. And there was also a new face in the political arena, Harry S. Truman. Truman had taken the place of the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt after his death in April and would prove to be considerably less sympathetic towards the communists than his predecessor. With political turmoil looming on the horizon, these three men had much to contemplate, but despite their differences, they still shared a common goal: to ensure that Germany should never wage war again. With this in mind, during the Potsdam Conference, it was agreed that Germany should be split into 4 occupation zones. What eventually became known as West Germany would be divided between Britain, America, and France, whereas East Germany would be occupied by the Soviets. The capital, Berlin, which was within the Eastern Soviet sector, would also be divided between the Allies, with the United States and Great Britain controlling the West and Russians controlling the East. The Soviet soldiers had set about occupying Berlin after their victory in May, but by July they were joined by the first American, British and French occupation troops as they moved into the western sectors of the city. Those who observed Berlin in the aftermath of the war were taken aback by the state of the capital, where they found much of the population suffering from starvation and attempting to live amongst the rubble of devastated buildings. Almost all transport in and out of Berlin was now inoperative, and adding to the problem of food shortages, bombed-out sewers had contaminated the city's water supplies. The Allied aerial attacks of the past few years had clearly taken their toll, and combined with the large artillery pounding from the Soviets during the Battle of Berlin, up to a third of the city had been destroyed. In early July, Churchill was among those who witnessed the damage to the city firsthand. As he walked through the devastated streets, passing the wrecked government buildings, Churchill was clearly moved by what he saw, and later said that his hate for the Germans had died along with their surrender. But despite any sympathy Churchill may have had for the German population, the Allied leaders were eager to deal justice to those responsible for the Nazi regime and its crimes. Hitler's war of aggression had led to an immense loss of life, with over 20 million dead in the Soviet Union alone. Tragically, the greater proportion of war casualties in Russia and most European nations had been civilian rather than military, and as the end of the war approached, the Allies began to discover the true horror of how so many people had died. During the advance on Berlin, American and Soviet commanders had discovered concentration camps filled with victims from all over Europe and Russia. In some camps, none of the inmates had been left alive, and only piles of bodies remained. In others, those who had survived the horrors of their internment were severely malnourished and in a desperate state. It was soon evident that not thousands, but millions of people had been systematically murdered by the Nazis, including Soviet civilians, soldiers, ethnic Poles, gypsies, and those who had opposed the Nazi regime. Above all, the Nazis had targeted the Jews, and around 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population had been killed in what would later be called the Holocaust. As the war crimes mounted, at Potsdam it was decided that an international military tribunal, on behalf of the American, British, Russian and French governments, should be formed. This body would conduct the most famous of all war crime trials at Nuremberg, a town renowned for hosting Nazi rallies and considered the ceremonial birthplace of the party. It was felt that this was a fitting place to mark the Nazi symbolic demise, and the trial to punish the major war criminals of the European Axis countries would at least see some justice served for the horrors of Hitler's unforgiving regime. Among the highest-ranking Nazi officials sentenced at Nuremberg was Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and second-in-command to Adolf Hitler. He was sentenced to death for being a leading political and military aggressor in the war and for his role in the extermination of the Jews. But Göring would thwart the Nuremberg judges when he committed suicide the night before his public hanging. Others to be sentenced at Nuremberg were Rudolf Hess, who'd been Hitler's deputy before he was captured in Britain in 1941. Hess was given a life sentence and would remain in Spandau prison, Berlin, for the remainder of his days, dying allegedly by suicide August 1987. Karl Donitz, the initiator of the U-boat campaign and president of Nazi Germany in the days after Hitler's suicide, was given a 10-year sentence, and Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht, was sentenced to death by hanging. Many of the doctors who had performed medical experiments in Nazi concentration camps were also sentenced at Nuremberg. But as justice was dealt out to the Nazis, the Allies understood the Second World War was far from over, and although Nazi Germany was now defeated, their allies, the Japanese, were still at large. The so-called Empire of the Rising Sun had begun the war with the West back in December 1941, when they bombed the American naval base at the now legendary Pearl Harbor, and their conquests across Southeast Asia and the islands of the Pacific had been as every bit as successful as the German advance across Western Europe. But as American naval forces recovered their strength, bit by bit, the Allies had begun to oust the enemy from their conquered terrain. From New Guinea to the Philippines, the Japanese were soon fighting defensive battles, and by the summer of 1944, the island-hopping campaign of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had brought Allied forces to the Mariana Islands and closer than ever to Japanese home territory. Throughout the spring of 1945, the drive towards enemy home territory continued, and American Joint Chiefs of Staff began to discuss the final invasion plans for Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. Japan was an archipelago made up of thousands of mountainous and volcanic islands, which made its invasion a daunting prospect. Of the four main islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, there were few areas suitable for invasion. Only the beaches on the Kanto plain of Honshu, southwest and southeast of Tokyo, and the beaches of Kyushu presented suitable attack zones. The Allies decided that a two-stage invasion should be launched, the first of which, codenamed Operation Olympic, would attack southern Kyushu. After building air bases here, cover would then be provided for the next step, Operation Coronet, which was the attack on Tokyo Bay on Honshu. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November 1st, and the combined naval armada would be the largest ever assembled in the history of warfare. 14 U.S. divisions were scheduled to take part in the initial landings, and once the invasion of Honshu was underway, 25 divisions would be involved. The main concern for the Americans was the potential for huge casualty rates. The Japanese had demonstrated that they were willing to fight to the death if necessary, and there were also fears of biological warfare, which the Japanese had used during their war with China. It was estimated that there could be over 1 million US casualties during the attack, and in April 1945, the extremes to which the Japanese would go to protect their homeland had taken an even more sinister turn. The heavily fortified island of Okinawa, which lay 340 miles from Japan, was to be used as a staging post in the invasion of Honshu, and on April 1st, British and American ships delivered Marine and Army divisions to its shores. But as the Marines struggled to root out the enemy, the Allied invasion force was to encounter Japan's most lethal weapon. The Japanese had turned to the ancient myth of the kamikaze to save their empire, and had set in motion their last great attack, Operation Chrysanthemum. Wave after wave of pilots plunged towards the Allied ships and to their deaths. In the next 3 months, 36 Allied vessels were sunk and hundreds more were damaged, while the battle to wrestle Okinawa from the enemy continued. Although the Allies finally prevailed and won the bitter struggle, by the time the campaign was over on June 22nd, there were more than 50,000 American casualties, with at least 12,000 fatalities. Even the mission's commander, General Buckner, had been killed. In the first 6 months of 1945, US casualties in the Pacific had exceeded those suffered during the previous 3 years put together, and put Allied commanders in no doubt that any attempt at invading the home islands would indeed lead to not thousands, but possibly millions of casualties. But despite Allied convictions that Japanese military and civilians alike would fight to the bitter end to defend their homeland, by the summer of 1945, many people in Japan were desperate for peace. Since February, over 60 cities around the country had been bombarded by LeMay's terror attacks, and Tokyo was in ruins. The Diet Building, where the Japanese government gathered, was soon one of the few structures left standing. As the death toll rose and industries vital to the Japanese war effort were destroyed, the situation in the country became desperate. Millions of people began to flee from the cities, and those that stayed faced a dismal existence. In addition to the bomb attacks, General LeMay had also launched Operation Starvation, in which vital water routes and ports were mined to disrupt enemy shipping. Before long, there were desperate fuel and food shortages, and wildlife deteriorated in the home islands. For the first time, Japanese civilians began to turn against the military. Across the country, people called for peace, desperate to end the war, as the American bombers continued to destroy everything in their path. Changes in Japanese leadership also began to reflect the country's hopes for peace. The warmongering Prime Minister Tojo, who had led Japan into war in 1941, had been forced to resign after the fall of Saipan in the summer of 1944. His replacement, Kuniaki Koiso, was in office for less than 9 months, and after his fall from government in April 1945, Baron Kantaro Suzuki had been elected to govern the country. Prime Minister Suzuki was a retired admiral and an aged hero of the Russo-Japanese War, and unlike the more militant members of the government, he did not believe that his country should go down fighting. His presence in government was a clear indication that the peace party was prevailing in Japan, and by now, even the Japanese Emperor Hirohito began to press for concrete plans to end the war, realizing that his empire had no hope of surviving against the American onslaught. As the conflict in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, the call for peace became more urgent than ever, as the full weight of American forces were now focused on the Pacific. The aim of Prime Minister Suzuki's cabinet was to secure any peace terms short of an unconditional surrender, and to do this, Suzuki turned to an unlikely ally. Way back in April 1941, Japan had signed a neutrality pact with Russia, and although the Japanese were also bound to Nazi Germany after signing the Tripartite Pact, they had made the decision not to join Hitler when he began his war on the Soviets in June 1941. With the agreement with Russia still standing in 1945, the Japanese cabinet hoped that the Soviets could act as mediators for a negotiated surrender with the Allies. Suzuki and his officials decided to send Prince Fumimaru Konoe to Moscow to head the peace delegation. Konoe had tried desperately to prevent Japan from going to war with America in the first place, and it was hoped that he could now somehow secure a peaceful future for his country. However, the Japanese had no idea that Stalin had already made an agreement with the British and Americans concerning the future of Japan. During the Yalta Conference in February 1945, with little consideration of the treaty made with the Japanese 4 years earlier, the Soviet leader agreed to participate in the war against Imperial Japan 3 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany. In return, he was promised attractive territorial concessions, including Japanese-occupied Manchuria, the Kuril Islands, and Port Arthur in Korea, which were all beneath the Japanese sphere of influence. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that when Suzuki's delegates contacted the Soviets to negotiate peace, they were met with silence from Moscow, and soon fears began to grow that the Soviets could pose as much of a threat as the Americans. On the day the Potsdam Conference commenced on July 17th, US and British warships fired 200,000 tons of shells into the coastal area northeast of Tokyo as the build-up to invasion continued. Soon after, the Soviet Union recalled all embassy staff and families from Japan, hinting that they also intended to attack. The future was looking decidedly bleak for the land of the rising sun. But there was soon another unexpected twist in the tangled intricacies of world politics, as Truman and Churchill became increasingly concerned with what appeared to be aggressive expansionism on the part of the Soviets. By July, the Red Army controlled the Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, and refugees fearing a communist takeover were fleeing in their millions. Contrary to agreements that had been made at Yalta in February, Stalin had also set up a communist government in Poland, against the wishes of most Poles. The Soviet leader defended his actions, insisting his control of Eastern Europe was a defensive measure against possible future attack. But as communist influence grew in Europe, America and Great Britain were beginning to fear that the Japanese were the least of their worries. Truman harbored deep suspicions of the communists and was anxious that in East Asia, as elsewhere, Russia should make as little headway as possible. As far as the American president was concerned, the less the Soviet Union was involved in the last stages of the war, the better, and it was with great relief that he received news that there might be an alternative to Russia's involvement. This ray of hope was the Manhattan Project, a secret US scheme to develop Albert Einstein's research in nuclear fission. Scientists had been quietly developing Einstein's theories at Chicago University, and on July 16th, a breakthrough was made. In New Mexico, scientists successfully tested the deadliest and most powerful weapon on Earth, the atom bomb, and with this weapon at their fingertips, the Americans realized they could shorten the war and reduce American casualties without the aid of the communists. As Truman began to make all attempts to exclude the Soviet Union as an invading force, the race for Japan was on. At 20th Air Force Headquarters in the Marianas, Curtis LeMay and his staff worked around the clock to devise a plan for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. The Soviets, in the meantime, were gathering forces on the border with Manchuria in southeast China in preparation for their agreed invasion of Japanese territory, scheduled for August 8th, exactly 3 months after the surrender of Nazi Germany. As tensions mounted back in Potsdam, there were sudden changes in the political arena. Winston Churchill had left the conference on July 25th to hear the outcome of the British election, but he had not been re-elected. Clement Attlee now returned to Germany in his place as the new British Prime Minister and to join Truman and Stalin in the final decision-making of the war. Together, they made a final plea for Japan to surrender in the Potsdam Declaration on July 26th. Allied terms were that those responsible for the policies that had led to war were to be forever eliminated, the war criminals should be punished, and Japan occupied. Back in Japan, Suzuki, still waiting and hoping for a response from the Soviet Union to their pleas for a peace agreement, gave a seemingly inscrutable reply, perhaps due in some part to the ambiguities of the Japanese language. For the Allies, this was a final gesture of defiance, and on August 6, 1945, the history of warfare was changed forever. Truman ordered the atom bomb to be loaded onto a B-29 plane named after the pilot's mother, Enola Gay. It took off from the runway on the island of Tinian and set off for its target, an important military center called Hiroshima with a civilian population of over 300,000. It was a calm, sunny Monday morning, and the city was bustling with activity when at 8:15 a.m. the bomb was dropped. The devastation spread over 4 square miles, killing 30% of the population instantly. Humans and buildings alike disintegrated in the explosion, and the firestorm that ensued claimed many more lives. All that was left of Hiroshima by the time the smoke had cleared was a wasteland of flattened streets, many of its inhabitants now nothing but literally shadows burnt into crumbling walls by the blast of white light. 4 hours after the attack, the Japanese government didn't know what had happened and were only given some indication when a plane was dispatched to survey the city. A huge cloud of smoke was still rising above Hiroshima, but the true horror of the situation was only just beginning. The Japanese soon realized that the death toll was rising as survivors began dying from radiation sickness. While Japan reeled from the attack, President Truman made the announcement that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and sternly warned if the Japanese do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on Earth. 2 days after the attack on Hiroshima, the Soviets began to storm across the border into Manchuria on August 8th, ending all hopes the Americans had of keeping the Soviets out of the Pacific theater. But Tokyo still failed to respond to the call for an unconditional surrender, and on August 9th, Truman carried out his threat by dropping yet another bomb on Japan, this time on the city of Nagasaki. As another city crumbled into ruin, the Japanese government and the emperor realized they no longer commanded the fate of their country. Faced with further nuclear attacks, Emperor Hirohito was forced to put aside any hopes of an honorable end to the war. The unendurable must be endured, he announced, and finally at midday on August 15, 1945, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and agreed to unconditional surrender. 1 day later, President Truman made the speech that the world had been waiting for. When the news of surrender arrived, a surge of relief swept across the American forces who'd been battling against Japan for almost 4 years. The bloodshed was finally at an end, and the Pacific War was over. On August 30th, U.S. troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on a beach south of Tokyo, marking the beginning of America's occupation of Japan. And as U.S. command was firmly established, the stars and stripes were triumphantly raised over the Japanese homeland. Later that same day, the commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur, flew into Atsugi Airfield in Tokyo and prepared to take control over the conquered empire. On the morning of September 2nd, the Japanese delegation boarded the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay to make the unconditional surrender official. MacArthur, who was to take on the role of new Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, directed the ceremony, which marked the end of the Pacific conflict, and his speech to the onlookers reflected the hopes of millions of people around the world that finally peace would be restored. Representing Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese Foreign Minister Shigemitsu formally surrendered for his country and committed Japan to the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. And when all the nations that had taken part in the Pacific battles had signed the document, MacArthur drew the war to a poignant close by saying, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world." The Second World War officially came to an end at 9:08 on September 2nd, 1945. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Japanese now laid down their arms. On September 4th, Imperial forces surrendered on Wake Island, 3 years and 4 months after the Americans had been driven from its shores. In Malaya and throughout Southeast Asia Command, British Commonwealth forces accepted the surrender of the Japanese troops, and soon the Union Jack was flying proudly over the British colonial city of Singapore once more, almost 4 years after its invasion. In the Philippines, the once known Tiger of Malaya, General Yamashita, surrendered the remainder of his army to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had led the battle to defend the island nation back in 1942. The general had been held in prison camps since surrendering to the enemy 40 months earlier, and the moment to deal justice to the man responsible for so many American and Filipino deaths had come not a moment too soon for Wainwright. Just as the Nuremberg trials had judged those in Nazi Germany, those deemed responsible for the war in the Far East would be punished for their part in the bloodshed. Along with Yamashita, the wartime Premier General Tojo, who had been so eager to lead his country into battle against the West, would be given a harsh judgment and sentenced to death for his crimes. Meanwhile, as all dreams of empire building gradually disappeared, the Japanese would learn to live alongside the Americans as the occupation of their country began. Japan would now evolve into a new nation where foreigners infiltrated every walk of life, and ancient laws and customs were adapted to suit a very different existence. Although many years of struggle lay ahead, as the horrors of war slowly started to fade away, Japan, like Germany, would emerge transformed from the ruins of conflict. The Second World War had raged for 6 bitter years and claimed millions of lives from Europe to Asia and beyond. But as it ended, humanity could finally hope for a better future as the dawn of a new era in world history was about to begin. Author's note. If you're listening to this statement, having worked your way through almost 150,000 words, then you've my gratitude and respect. It's been the biggest book of my life, a roller coaster of emotions to work through while trying my very best to accurately reflect the period of history recorded here. We now live in times of different conflicts, the global threat of suicide bombers and terrorism at its worst. Limited military activity appears mostly to be afflicted by non-manned drones and missiles, war by remote control. I do hope that the history of World War II is never repeated, and there is never the threat of nuclear bombing again. There are, however, a lot of these particularly devastating weapons in the world's arsenal, and it takes the action of just a few unstable minds to press a few buttons. In the alleged words of Mark Twain, history never repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Liam Dale, September 3rd, 2019, 80 years to the day after the start of World War II.